In September 1980, while Britain slept, its government staged the end of the world. Exercise Square Leg was the largest and most realistic Cold War civil defense simulation ever conducted in Britain. A 4-day rehearsal for nuclear holocaust that revealed not readiness, but the terrifying inadequacy of survival planning and the psychological fracture between official optimism and inevitable annihilation. September 14th, 1980. 0600 hours. Across Britain, civil servants arrived at work to find envelopes marked "Exercise Only," not to be opened before 14th September 1980. Inside was a scenario typed on Ministry of Defense letterhead, clinical in its language, apocalyptic in its content. At 1100 hours GMT today, intelligence reports indicate Soviet forces have crossed the inner German border. NATO authorization for tactical nuclear weapons deployment expected within 72 hours. Regional controllers are to activate transition to war protocols immediately. Exercise Square Leg was the code name for the most comprehensive civil defense drill Britain had ever attempted. For 4 days, from September 14th to 18th, local authorities, emergency services, and government officials across the United Kingdom would simulate their response to a full-scale nuclear war with the Soviet Union. But this was not a symbolic gesture. This was not a training video screened in a conference room. Square Leg involved over 40,000 participants, including military personnel, police, fire services, hospital staff, and local government officials. Real equipment would be deployed. Real command structures activated. Real decisions made under simulated crisis conditions. And the scenario they were given was not designed for comfort. To understand what Square Leg revealed, you must first understand what Britain had been telling itself about nuclear war. By 1980, the Cold War had calcified into routine terror. The public had been conditioned by decades of public information campaigns, protect and survive leaflets distributed to households, films showing families building makeshift fallout shelters from doors and sandbags. The message was consistent. Nuclear war is survivable. Follow instructions. Stay calm. Britain will endure. But behind the reassuring graphics and calm BBC narration, British planners knew something else entirely. The 1970s had seen a fundamental shift in civil defense philosophy. The concept of evacuation had been abandoned as logistically impossible. Mass sheltering programs had been deemed too expensive. What remained was a doctrine called "stay put." Citizens would remain in their homes, improvise protection, and wait for government coordination that planners privately acknowledged would never come. Britain's civil defense budget in 1980 was approximately £40 million annually, roughly the cost of a single Tornado fighter jet. The entire national stockpile of radiation monitoring equipment could outfit only a fraction of local authorities. Hospital surge capacity for mass casualties existed only on paper. Food reserves were calculated to last weeks in a scenario where agricultural collapse would be permanent. Yet publicly, the government maintained the illusion of preparedness. Exercise Square Leg was designed to test that illusion against reality. The geopolitical context was darkening rapidly. By 1980, détente had collapsed. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in December 1979 had shattered any remaining illusions of peaceful coexistence. NATO was preparing to deploy Pershing II and cruise missiles to Europe. The Soviet Union was expanding its SS-20 intermediate-range nuclear arsenal. Both superpowers were locked in a spiral of escalation that made accidental war, or deliberate war, feel increasingly plausible. British intelligence assessments painted a grim picture. In the event of European conflict, Soviet doctrine called for rapid armored advance supported by tactical nuclear weapons to prevent NATO reinforcement. NATO's response doctrine, codified as flexible response, guaranteed nuclear escalation if conventional defense failed. The British public, reading newspapers over breakfast, understood this abstractly. Government planners understood it with mathematical precision. Home Office models projected that a Soviet attack on Britain would likely involve between 80 and 200 warheads, targeting military installations, ports, airfields, communication centers, and major cities. Total yield approximately 200 megatons, equivalent to 15,000 Hiroshima bombs. Projected casualties, in the carefully neutral language of civil defense planning, immediate deaths, 29 to 33 million. Serious injuries requiring hospitalization, 7 million total UK population, 56 million. More than half the nation would be dead or dying within 72 hours. This was the scenario Exercise Square Leg would simulate. The exercise was planned in utmost secrecy. Only senior officials knew the full scope. Local authorities were briefed on a need-to-know basis. The public would not be informed until the exercise was underway, and even then, only minimally. The reason for secrecy was not operational security. It was psychological. Duncan Campbell, the investigative journalist who would later obtain classified square-leg documents, wrote in October 1980, "The government fears not Soviet missiles, but British panic. They have designed civil defense not to save lives, but to preserve the appearance of control, after control becomes impossible." Square Leg would test whether that appearance could be maintained. The answer would terrify everyone involved. The scenario unfolded with the relentless logic of nightmare. Day 1, September 14th. Conventional war erupts in Europe. Soviet forces cross the East German border. NATO mobilizes. British forces deployed to the continent at home. Transition to war protocols activate. Regional government headquarters, hardened bunkers designed to survive nuclear attack, begin staffing up emergency services, move to heightened readiness. The British public, going about Sunday errands, noticed nothing. Day 2, September 15th. Tactical nuclear weapons are used on the European battlefield. NATO responds in kind. Escalation accelerates. In Britain, civil defense warnings are issued. The attack warning red signal, a rising and falling siren tone, is tested in some regions. Evacuation of government personnel to protected facilities begins. Day 3, September 16th. Strategic exchange commences. At 10:30 hours, simulated Soviet missiles strike Britain. The targets were chosen with brutal precision. The square leg scenario assumed 130 nuclear detonations across the United Kingdom. The target list included RAF Lakenheath, RAF Mildenhall, GCHQ Cheltenham, Fastlane Naval Base, the Clyde submarine pens, major ports, including Liverpool, Southampton, Portsmouth, communication centers, fuel depots, and the inevitable, London. The capital would be hit by multiple warheads. Whitehall, the seat of government, was assumed destroyed. The Backup Coordination Center at the Admiralty Citadel, would survive only hours before being rendered inoperable by electromagnetic pulse, radiation, and infrastructure collapse. The scenario did not include peripheral damage. It did not account for panic, for roads choked with fleeing civilians, for hospitals overwhelmed within minutes, for the breakdown of communication systems, for fires spreading uncontrolled through cities whose water mains had been shattered by overpressure. It assumed a best-case, coordinated response. What participants discovered was that even in the best case, Britain would cease to function as a nation-state within 48 hours. Regional controllers, senior officials responsible for coordinating response in their districts, faced immediate, cascading failures. Communication lines were simulated as cut radio networks were overwhelmed. Reports from local authorities arrived hours late, incomplete, often contradictory. In South Yorkshire, controllers attempted to coordinate response to simulated strikes on Sheffield and Rotherham. The scenario assumed 200,000 immediate casualties in Sheffield alone. More than a third of the city's population medical services were assessed as non-functional within 2 hours. Fire services, with equipment designed for peacetime structural fires, were deemed unable to respond to the firestorms sweeping through urban centers. One participant, whose identity remains redacted in archived documents, wrote in his post-exercise report, "We were told to coordinate evacuation of casualties to hospitals. There were no hospitals. We were told to establish decontamination stations. There was no water. We were told to maintain public order. There was no public, only radiation and rubble." The exercise revealed what planners had known but never publicly acknowledged. British civil defense doctrine depended on systems, power grids, telephone networks, transportation infrastructure, medical supply chains that would be obliterated in the first minutes of nuclear war. Without those systems, coordination was impossible. Without coordination, survival was random. One of the most disturbing aspects of Square Leg was its psychological impact on participants. Interviews conducted after the exercise revealed widespread trauma among officials who had spent 4 days simulating the deaths of millions. Emergency room doctors role-played triage decisions, choosing who would receive morphine and who would be left to die in agony from radiation sickness. Police officers practiced writing reports, knowing there would be no functioning courts, no prisons, no legal system to process crimes that would become commonplace. Looting, hoarding, violent competition for uncontaminated resources. One fire chief in Greater Manchester wrote, "We were asked to estimate response times to fires in residential areas. I told them honestly, we won't respond. Our trucks won't move because the roads will be impassable. Our men won't report because they'll be dead or trying to save their own families. I was reprimanded for defeatist attitude. They wanted optimistic numbers. I gave them the truth. We would watch the cities burn and be unable to do anything." The gap between official doctrine and physical reality became unbridgeable. The public information campaign supporting civil defense rested on a fundamental deception. The Protect and Survive materials implied nuclear war was survivable through individual preparedness. Stay indoors, improvise shelter, follow government instructions. But Square Leg demonstrated that government instructions would never arrive. Radio broadcasts would cease, authorities would be dead or isolated in bunkers. The emergency broadcasts planned for post-attack scenarios, assumed transmitters would survive, power would be available, and someone would be alive and functional to operate them. Exercise participants discovered that electromagnetic pulse from high-altitude detonations would fry unshielded electronics across entire regions. The BBC's contingency transmitters, hardened against attack, could broadcast, but the radios in civilian homes would be non-functional. Messages would be transmitted into silence. One square-leg scenario planner, interviewed anonymously years later, admitted, "We knew protect and survive was theater. Its purpose was not survival. It was to prevent pre-attack panic. If people believed they could survive by following instructions, they would remain calm and orderly during the escalation phase. Once the bombs fell, the instructions became irrelevant. But by then, it wouldn't matter what the public believed." The exercise was revealing something more profound than logistical failure. It was exposing a moral catastrophe. A government that had promised protection while knowing protection was impossible, that had published survival guides while planning only for managing mass death. By day 4, September 18th, the exercise entered its post-attack stabilization phase. This was the theoretical period when survivors would emerge from shelters, government would reassert control, and recovery efforts would begin. The simulation collapsed into absurdity. Controllers were asked to plan for restoration of essential services, water, power, food distribution. But scenario parameters indicated all water treatment facilities within 50 miles of major cities were destroyed or contaminated. Power stations were offline. Transportation networks were impassable. Food stocks in urban areas would be consumed or spoiled within days. Radiation levels would remain lethal for weeks across 40% of the country. "We were supposed to coordinate relief efforts," one participant recalled. "Relief from where? By whom?" Every nearby authority was in the same condition. The Americans and Europeans would be dealing with their own devastation. There was no cavalry coming. We were asked to plan logistics for a nation that had ceased to exist. The final scenario update arrived at 1600 hours on September 18th. Casualty estimates revised. Immediate deaths, 29 million. Severe injuries, 7 million. Radiation sickness developing, 4 million. Uninjured population, 16 million. Concentrated in rural areas outside primary target zones medical care, effectively non-existent. Food distribution, collapsed. Governance, localized to surviving bunkers with no effective communication or enforcement capability. Prognosis, continued casualties from radiation, disease, starvation, and social breakdown, estimated at 6 to 10 million additional deaths over following 6 months. The United Kingdom, as a functioning society, would have a life expectancy measured in hours after the first detonation. Exercise Square Leg ended at 1800 hours, September 18th, 1980. Participants filed out of bunkers into a Britain still intact, shops open, traffic moving, children playing in parks. The dissonance shattered many of them. The British government classified Exercise Square Leg immediately upon its conclusion. Official reports were stamped confidential and distributed only to senior ministry officials. The public was informed only that a civil defense exercise had occurred, with no details provided about scenario, scope, or findings. The secrecy was deliberate and calculated. Internal memoranda, later obtained through Freedom of Information requests decades later, reveal government panic over square legs results. Home Office officials described the exercise as profoundly disturbing and recommended against public release of findings. One memo, dated October 2, 1980, stated, "Full disclosure of square leg scenario and response inadequacies would undermine public confidence in civil defense and potentially fuel anti-nuclear movements. Recommend minimal public engagement." But the truth began leaking almost immediately. Duncan Campbell, investigative journalist for New Statesman magazine, had cultivated sources within local government and emergency services for years. Within weeks of Square Leg's conclusion, he began receiving anonymous packages, photocopied scenario documents, participant debriefs, casualty projections. On October 3, 1980, Campbell published World War III, an exclusive preview, a devastating exposé of Square Leg. The article revealed the 130 warhead scenario, the 29 million casualty projection, and most damningly, the government's own assessment that civil defense plans were inadequate to the point of meaninglessness in the face of actual nuclear war. The headline was set in type, designed to look like a government warning poster. The article opened with a single paragraph. In September, while you slept, shopped, and went to work, the British government killed you. They did it on paper, in a simulation, but the calculations were real. The bombs were real. The targets were real. Only your death was theoretical. But the government now knows, and has chosen not to tell you, that if it happens for real, there is nothing they can do to save you. The response was explosive. Campbell's article catalyzed what became one of the largest anti-nuclear movements in British history. By 1981, CND membership had tripled. Local councils began declaring themselves nuclear-free zones, refusing to participate in future civil defense exercises. In Sheffield, the City Council published its own report, South Yorkshire and Nuclear War, which used square leg data to demonstrate that civil defense was a cruel deception offering false hope where none exists. The Sheffield report was blunt in its conclusions. A single 1-megaton warhead on Sheffield would kill 250,000 people immediately and doom another 100,000 to death from radiation and infrastructure collapse within weeks. No amount of stay-put preparation will alter this. The only meaningful civil defense is preventing nuclear war from occurring. The Greater London Council, under Ken Livingstone, went further. It commissioned public information materials directly contradicting Government Protect and Survive guidance, stating plainly, there is no effective protection against nuclear weapons. Government advice suggesting otherwise is dangerous and misleading. The British government responded with fury and denial. Parliamentary questions about Square Leg were deflected or answered with carefully crafted non-responses. When pressed on casualty projections, government ministers stated that scenarios were hypothetical and not predictions. When asked about civil defense adequacy, they cited ongoing improvements and comprehensive planning without addressing the fundamental conclusions of the exercise. Home Secretary William Whitelaw, in a November 1980 response to Parliament, stated, "Civil defense measures are designed to minimize casualties and facilitate recovery in the event of attack. While no system can eliminate all risk, the government is confident that current preparations represent a responsible approach to an admittedly difficult challenge." This was, at best, carefully euphemistic. At worst, deliberate deception. Internal government assessments, later declassified, paint a different picture. A Cabinet Office review from December 1980 concluded, "Square leg demonstrated that current civil defense posture is cosmetic rather than functional. Meaningful protection would require expenditures in the billions, hardened shelters for major population centers, vast stockpiles of food and medical supplies, redundant communication systems, investments politically and economically impossible. We are left managing public perception rather than public safety." The admission is chilling. Britain's civil defense policy was theater, designed not to save lives, but to maintain social order during the escalation period before nuclear exchange, and to provide the illusion of governmental competence in a scenario where government would cease to exist. In 1982, the government conducted Exercise Hard Rock, an even larger civil defense simulation involving similar nuclear war scenarios. The results were, if anything, worse. Hard Rock assumed 200 warheads, striking the UK with casualties exceeding 33 million. Post-exercise assessments concluded that civil defense improvements implemented since Square Leg had negligible effect. Duncan Campbell obtained Hard Rock documents as well, publishing Bad Day at Hard Rock in 1982. His conclusion: the government has learned from Square Leg not how to save lives, but how to better conceal the fact that lives cannot be saved. One Hard Rock participant, a senior police official, provided an anonymous interview years later. "We sat in that bunker for 4 days, making decisions we knew were fantasy. Coordinate this, evacuate that, restore order. It was a script we were reading for an audience that would be dead. The only honest moment came on day 4, when someone asked, 'Why are we pretending?' And the controller said, 'Because if we stop pretending, we have to admit we've built weapons we cannot survive using, and aimed them at cities full of people who trust us to protect them.' We went back to our scripts." In 1983, the BBC aired Threads, a docudrama depicting nuclear war's impact on Sheffield. The film used Square Leg casualty data, infrastructure collapse timelines, and civil defense failure scenarios. It remains one of the most disturbing pieces of television ever broadcast. Unsparing in its depiction of societal disintegration, mass death, and the long horror of post-attack survival. The film's writer, Barry Hines, had consulted with Sheffield City Council officials who had participated in Square Leg. He later stated, "The government didn't want this film made because it showed what their own exercises had proven, that everything they'd told the public about survival was a lie, protect and survive was a fairy tale." The reality was Threads. Threads was watched by 9.6 million viewers. Its impact was profound and lasting. Many who saw it described nightmares, panic attacks, existential dread. It crystallized, in visceral visual form, what Square Leg had revealed. Nuclear war was not survivable in any meaningful sense. Britain would not endure. Civilization would collapse. The living would envy the dead. The government never produced another protect and survive campaign. Exercise Square Leg documents began entering public archives in the early 2000s, released under the 30-year declassification rule. Researchers, historians, and journalists have since reconstructed the exercise in detail. What emerges is a portrait of institutional cognitive dissonance, a government that knew it could not protect its citizens, yet maintained elaborate systems pretending otherwise. Academic studies of square leg have concluded that the exercise was less a test of civil defense capabilities than a documentation of their absence. Jacqueline Arnold's 2014 PhD thesis, British Civil Defense Policy in Response to the Threat of Nuclear Attack, 1972 to 1986, analyzed square leg and subsequent exercises, concluding the primary function of civil defense in the 1980s was psychological management, maintaining public morale and governmental legitimacy in the face of an insoluble security dilemma. Actual casualty reduction was secondary, if considered at all. The exercise revealed truths that remain uncomfortable today. Modern nuclear arsenals make civil defense meaningless at scale. A single modern warhead carries destructive power that no civil infrastructure can mitigate. Multiple warheads render survival a matter of geography and chance, not preparation. Governments facing nuclear threat must choose between honest acknowledgement of vulnerability, which risks public panic and political catastrophe, or reassuring deception, which preserves order at the cost of truth. The psychological impact of living under nuclear threat is not abstract. Participants in square leg, people who spent 4 days simulating mass death, carried trauma for years. Some never spoke of it publicly. The exercise demonstrated that contemplating nuclear war, even in simulation, inflicts psychological damage. The Cold War ended in 1989 without the apocalypse square leg rehearsed. But the lessons remain urgent. As of 2024, 9 nations possess approximately 12,500 nuclear warheads. The United States and Russia each maintain arsenals capable of destroying industrial civilization multiple times over newer nuclear powers. Pakistan, India, North Korea have smaller but growing stockpiles. The probability of nuclear use, through accident, miscalculation, or deliberate decision, has not disappeared. It has simply faded from daily consciousness. Current civil defense planning in nuclear-armed states remains inadequate to the threat. Modern protect and survive equivalents, disaster preparedness websites, emergency alert systems assume survivable scenarios, hurricanes, earthquakes, terrorist attacks. They do not address strategic nuclear exchange because to do so would require admitting what square leg proved: there is no meaningful preparation for such an event. Exercise square leg stands as a monument to a particular kind of Cold War honesty, the honesty of simulation, where pretense collapses under the weight of scenario data. The 29 million casualties projected by square leg were British citizens with names, families, lives. They existed in government planning as statistics. In reality, they were people who would have been vaporized, burned, crushed, irradiated, or left to starve in the aftermath of decisions made in Moscow and Washington. The exercise asked, "Can we save them?" and answered, "No." It then asked, "Will we tell them?" and answered, "No." There is a peculiar cruelty in offering false hope. The Protect and Survive campaign told British families they could survive nuclear war by sheltering under tables, stockpiling tinned food, and following radio broadcasts. Square leg proved those families would be dead before they finished reading the instructions. Yet the government continued distributing the booklets, continued running the public information films, continued maintaining the architecture of reassurance. One can argue this was necessary, that admitting helplessness would have caused panic, that maintaining morale was a strategic imperative, that leaders cannot tell citizens they are defenseless. One can also argue this was obscene, that people deserved truth about existential threats, that consent to policy requires honest information, that democracy cannot function when governments systematically deceive populations about survival prospects. Square leg forces the question, what do we owe each other in the face of annihilation? The exercise suggested the answer was the truth, even when the truth is unbearable. Even when the truth is, we rehearsed your death, and there was nothing we could do to prevent it. In 1980, Britain staged the end of the world and learned it could not be stopped. The sirens were tested, the shelters were planned, the instructions were printed, but the truth was written in classified documents, filed in government basements. When the bombs fall, the only survivors will be those who were lucky with geography. The government cannot save you. The shelters will not save you. The instructions will not save you. All that can save you is the bombs never falling. Exercise Square Leg proved that Britain knew this, admitted it in private, and lied about it in public. The lie was called civil defense. The truth was filed away for decades. Now we know what they knew then. The rehearsal for Armageddon revealed Armageddon is unrehearsable. You cannot practice for the end of the world. You can only prevent it. Or accept that when it comes, everyone dies together, and no amount of paperwork, planning, or government protocol will change that. Britain learned this lesson in September 1980. The world has yet to fully absorb it. The warheads are still there. The targets are still there. The scenarios are still there. Only the date is missing. Exercise Square Leg was not preparation for nuclear war. It was an admission that preparation is impossible. And that admission, buried in archives for decades, remains the most honest statement any government has made about nuclear weapons. If they are used, everything ends. No plans will matter. No instructions will help. Only prevention is possible. Everything else is theater. Everything else is denial. Everything else is the end.